Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we'll be discussing the game between the Sharks and the Blues, in which the Sharks have lost 5-2. And so now this is the 8th loss this month, in the month of December. Their only win coming against the Vancouver Canucks a few days ago in the second game under Bob Booner's regime here as coach. And so it's just not been a very successful month for the Sharks. And you could take a look at this game and say, well, the Sharks played well, and this is against the reigning Stanley Cup champions, one of the best teams in the league, certainly one of the best teams in the Western Conference. But you're, coming up near Christmas break, the holiday break, it's time to stop trying to take moral victories. I don't care how well you looked against the Coyotes. I don't care how well you looked against the Blues here, even if those two are very good teams. In the end, you still lost. In the end, you still got 0 points. And in the end, you are still getting further and further out of a wild card spot here in the Western Conference. And you're almost halfway through the season. And so at this point, sort of the only stat that really matters is whether or not you win or whether or not you lose. And the Sharks have been doing a lot of losing, even here under the new coach. And so this first period started off, as I said, the Sharks looked pretty good in the first period. They outshot the Blues pretty significantly, but no goals would be scored. However, at the start of the second period, Brent Burns would get the Sharks on the board, on the power play, in fact, which was nice to see after such an awful power play to end the last game against the Coyotes. But then Kyrou would respond quite shortly after, and then Schwartz would make it 2-1. Late in the second period, newcomer to the Sharks, Nason, would at least tie it up at 2, and we'd head into the third period tied at 2. Now, Bob Booner has been here for 4 games, and in 3 of those 4 games, besides the victory against the Canucks, the Sharks have gone into the third period tied at 2. And now in each of those 3 games, they've ended up losing that last 20 minutes of play and losing the game in regulation. Against the Rangers, they even had a 3-2 lead early in the third before losing 6-3. Against the Coyotes, they'd give up that late goal to Ekman Larsson to lose 3-2. And here against the Blues, they'd give up a relatively late goal with about 8 or so minutes left against Pietrangelo and end up losing 5-2 thanks to a couple of empty netters from O'Reilly and then Pietrangelo once more. However, it was still also some deja vu, considering the fact that in the last 3 or so minutes of this third period, the Sharks got another power play, and if they could get 1 goal, they'd at least tie it up at 3, but it was not the case. So it's hard to rag too much on the power play, because at least they scored Burns' goals, but you get these late game power plays, you really want to be able to score on them, and the Sharks have not been able to do that and take advantage of that in these past couple of games. First thing to talk about would be Martin Jones, and of course in the grand scheme of things, it's difficult to blame Jones too much for this game. It's 3 goals, which isn't great, sure, but you take a look at the Schwartz goal and it's basically an impossible shot to stop. The Pietrangelo one was a great shot, but you take a look at this Jordan Kyrou one and it's why you would say that, Jones does deserve a lot of the blame in this game, because the fact of the matter is that this Kyrou one is just an unacceptable shot to be let in. He's completely covered by he's quite covered by Vlasic. He only has the possibility of a weak backhand shot, so there's absolutely zero reason why Martin Jones should leave this 5-hole just wide open completely like he did in this situation. And there's a stat that exists here. It's more of an advanced stat for goaltenders, not really an NHL official stat, but it's called goals saved above average. And so basically, some people who are much smarter than me try to calculate based on the chances a team gives up, how many goals an average goaltender would give up, and then how many goals that team's goaltender would give up. So someone like Connor Hellebuck in Winnipeg is actually quite favorable, or is looked upon quite favorable, thanks to this stat, saying that maybe he's given, he saved his team 7 or 8 goals, saying that if the Jets had an average goaltender, they probably would have given up a few more goals. Martin Jones is on the completely other side of the spectrum and one of the worst goaltenders in the league in terms of this stat, and in terms of most stats, where it says basically if the Sharks had an average goaltender or a goaltender playing at an average level, they likely would have given up 7, 8, 10 less goals this season. And you take a look at a game like, 7, 8, 10 goals, maybe not seem like a lot in, just looking up these 40 games, but you take a look at just this game, an average goaltender probably doesn't make the save on Schwartz or Pietrangelo, but certainly makes the save on Kyrou. And, it's a completely different game, 2-2 in the last 8 or so minutes of the third period. Maybe the Sharks bring it to overtime, maybe the Sharks get the victory. So it wasn't an awful game by Jones, but the same problems still remain there for him. Next would be looking at the lineup, as there were a few changes to be made. One big one here is obviously the change from putting Marleau from the third line to the first line and putting Meier down to the third line. So obviously, under Bob Booner, the first 3 games, the top 6 has actually been pretty good, but the bottom 6 has been mostly non-existent. And so it seems as though to try and maybe spread the love a bit, they decided to put Meier on the third line. I do think the third line looked a bit better, and I do think the first line, as you'd expect, swapping Marleau for Meier, did look a bit worse, but still pretty good. So I don't think this was necessarily a negative change all that much, but I think the Kane, Couture, Meier line was looking very, very strong, and so I was a bit disappointed to see the line get split up. The other change was obviously on the fourth line. This was since the Joachim Blichfeld experiment didn't particularly work out, they decided to go with another player from the AHL, this being, I believe his name is pronounced Shellman, as well as obviously picking up Stefan Noesen off of waivers, and he actually had a pretty solid game. That brings me to my next point. Stefan Noesen looked pretty good here in the first period. He obviously got this goal. It wasn't, one that Jake Allen had like an impossibility of saving, but it was still a nice goal to get. The Sharks' fourth line contributing here for probably the first time under the new coach, and so he seems to be like a player who could be a pretty solid mainstay on the fourth line for the San Jose Sharks. Shellman, on the other hand, I thought he looked pretty good at the start of the game, certainly fell off a bit as time went on. I do think the good news for him is that unlike Blichfeld, who when he's not doing much offensively, he isn't really bringing anything to the table, Shellman does look at least somewhat more two-way forward-esque, and so even if he's not producing offensively, he can bring something to the table defensively, but Booner might find himself once again going back to the drawing boards in a couple of games unless something changes, and maybe trying out a different AHL forward, or maybe even bringing back someone like Gambrell, who was recently sent to the AHL. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action as quickly as tomorrow against the Vegas Golden Knights. This will actually be their final matchup against the Golden Knights this season. Recall, they lost twice in the first 2 games this season against the Golden Knights. This was game 1 and game 2 of the year is what I mean. But later on, they would win the third matchup. This would be during their very strong November. This was an overtime victory, so not necessarily super dominant. And we'll see how the Sharks can look in the rematch. As I said, the Sharks looked pretty good against the Coyotes. They looked pretty good here tonight against the Blues, but in the end, they got 0 points in those 2 games, and they'll look to turn that around against the Golden Knights. Class dismissed.